Okay, why am I not seeing? There we go. Namaste. Okay, I'm back. Is my microphone on? It is not. All right, microphone is on. Oh no, it's very loud. Okay, so loud. I need to talk less loud. Okay, we were talking about interviewing last week. We're a little bit ahead of the game because I think your mini lab or your lab on interviews isn't until next Tuesday. So I believe there's no lab tomorrow. So we're a little bit ahead of the game, which means we can go nice and slow and take our time and all of that jazz. So let's talk a little bit about interviewing. Did we finish off with this slide? Yes. So we're talking what a semi-structured interview is. Okay, so this is a chart from the textbook. I may have slightly spoiled what I think of, especially these ones. But I think it's an interesting pro tip. So, people in class, I will take it to you. Of these questions, oops, I know you haven't practiced the art of asking questions yet. But if you were to guess, what do you think might be wrong? Let's say just with this question. Did you enjoy the art program? Yeah, Reg. Yes, it is a yes or no question. And why is a yes or no question bad?
Because you can't elaborate on it and you could be saying yes or no for a multitude of reasons.
Okay. Yes. Also, they really suck. So I tend to think like yes or no questions, you're right, and you don't get any information, and then you have to ask follow-up questions. They really suck for flow. And this is what I found in doing interviews and listening to interviews. A yes or no question, right? Do you have many friends / get along with others your age? Yes. So they mess up the flow. And I always think of like yes or no questions as like a brick wall that you're crashing into in doing an interview, right? It's like you hit this and someone like, okay, Reg, do you have many friends? No. I'm sad for you, Reg. Right. He says no, and suddenly like the conversation sort of screeches to a halt, right? And I have to be like, okay, what is my follow-up question? How do I get out of this cul-de-sac I've driven into with my question, right? Like I've asked you a yes or no question, did you enjoy the art program? You said yes, and now I have to somehow, or even worse, no. No is going to be a tough one, right? Because then you're really stuck. So let's rephrase these. I'm going to make you do it. How would you rephrase question number 1? Did you enjoy the art program? Yeah, Erica. What did you like about the art program? Okay. Leica? Jesus. Nice. Right? Okay. And right there, right, that person suddenly has, they have to think, they have to be like, oh, well, I liked the, I don't know, paper mache. I liked the paper mache, right? I love paper mache. It was enjoyable to play with newspaper and glue. It just occurred to me that paper mache would now be an incredibly difficult thing because finding newspaper is increasingly difficult. Is paper mache, in fact, a lost art? Now I must leave and ponder this question. Goodbye. A phone call. from likely spam. Well, let's use Google's screening assistant for that. Okay, so that's a good question, right? What did you like about the art program? Rather than did you enjoy the art program? Which again, and especially if someone says no to this question, okay, well then even your probe questions like what activities did you like? Did you like the instructors? Well, if they didn't like it, now you're rammed up against that wall. This is much better because they're going to have to be like, well, I liked my instructor. But then you can ask, oh, was there anything you didn't like about it? Right? Much better questions. Okay. Do you have many friends or get along with others? Such a bad fucking question. Oh, I'm like, aren't the textbook authors supposed to be experts in the stuff they're writing about? Why did they write such a terrible question? Okay. Who wants to rewrite this awful question for me? Do you have many friends? Yes. Do you sometimes get into arguments with others? Actually, this is also a bad question. So, do you have many friends get along with others your age? How could you rephrase this into a better question? How do you get along with people your age? I mean, yeah. I mean, it's still a little like, well, I guess I get along pretty good.
How many friends you have? It's like it would like it's kind of
5.
Like the more friends, like depending on how others like in comparison, like the more friends tends to be like a more sociable person.
Okay.
Less friends, less sociable.
All right. It's good. It could be better. How can you get, like, open it up? Give people a lot of room to run. Erica. A little clunky. Do you just walk around? I'm not making fun of you, by the way. Writing interview questions is actually kind of hard. But always think about, like, how is this going to, like, would you tell me about your social engagements with the people that you engage with most frequently? You mean my friends? Yes, that is what I mean. Right? A little clunky, but you're on the right track.
I was mostly thinking, like, could you name a few, or like maybe not necessarily name a few friends, but describe them just personality-wise and tell me what you think about them.
Again, I think you're on the right track. It's maybe a little like, describe your friends to me. Tell me about their personalities. Are any of them single? No, I'm just kidding, right? Sorry, it's like okay, what is your experience making friends? That's not bad. I like it. Yeah, please.
You're looking specifically for like friends around the same age. You can be like, oh, do you keep up with classmates or former classmates?
Okay.
You're treating them as a cohort.
Okay. Yeah. Do you keep up or do you stay in touch? I guess. Do you? Is that kind of what you meant?
Yeah. Like, do you keep up with classmates? Isn't they really the same age group as you?
Okay.
Make it like a little bit more specific. Like if you wanted to know whether they get along with friends, you could somehow phrase the question of asking what sorts of topics or discussions do you and your friends not agree on?
Okay. Yeah. Somehow that way.
I don't know.
Sure. What kinds of things do you and your friends talk about? I'm going to be really colloquial and say stuff. You should not use that because that's way too colloquial, but I don't want to write longer sentences. Okay. If you just wanted to find out, I thought he was raising his hand, but he wasn't. If you just wanted to find out about someone's friends, like, what would you ask them? Like, you just want to know what kind of friends they have, right? You want to kind of get them to talk about their friends. Tell me about your friends, right? Absolutely. Tell me about your friends. And then, right, as opposed to, do you have many friends and get along with others your age, right? Oh my God. Like, tell me about your friends, right? The real trick with an interview is talking. It's you talking to people, right? You're not entering prompts into Chat GPT. You know, and I'm not making fun of you. Like, it's actually, I always say interviewing is much more of an art than it is a science, right? But you want to get people talking. You want to get them describing things, right? And you can ask them follow-up questions, right? Like if they're then talking about their friend, Tammy, right? I don't know why I chose Tammy. Well, then you can ask them some questions about Tammy. You can ask them as a kind of follow-up questions after they've described their friends. It's like, oh, are most of your friends kind of around the same age as you, or do you find you get along better with younger or older people, right? You can kind of then go into it once you get them talking, especially if this is kind of your introducing question, right? Your opening question, right? Like this one's really gonna run you into a brick wall, because it's gonna be like, Reg, do you have any friends? Right? Like, what if you get a negative response? It just, or like, do you get along with others your own age? Right? It's such a clunky question. Sorry, I want to poop on the textbook, but sometimes by seeing what other people do wrong, we can avoid those things. The goal is to get people talking, right? And do these questions get people talking? Okay, last one. Have you been getting along with your parents? Okay, do you enjoy spending time with your parents? Yeah. Okay, what activities?
What are your experiences with your parents? Like, that's pretty vague.
Okay. Vague can be okay. Vague can be okay. I'm thinking more of the phrasing there, but yeah, please in the back. Awesome. What kind of relationship do you have with your parents? Okay, right? And I don't mean to like, it's just like, it could be a little mechanical, right? Sometimes the way we phrase things in writing, and I know being in university accustoms us to speaking in very mechanical, like, jargony, but you definitely don't want that in an interview unless you're like interviewing an expert who understands the jargon. But like, I'm assuming that you're not like a parenting expert. Maybe then you could throw in some like, describe the quality of the relationship based on, Lazarstam's theory of, But other than that, right? What kind of relationship do you have with your parents? Is a good question. Again, really, really open, right? People could tell you, yeah, we don't really get along, and you could be like, oh, like, has that been true, like throughout your life, or is that just more of a recent thing? And they could be like, oh, yeah, it's really more of a recent thing. Ever since my dad got a red baseball hat and started yelling "Make America Great Again" all the time, like the quality of our relationship has really gone downhill. Whatever it happens to be, right? Yeah, what kind of relationship do you have? Tell me about your relationship with your parents, all of that kind of stuff, without it sounding too much like therapy. Okay. All right, this is a perfectly fine probe question. I changed slides. Okay. This perfectly fine probe question. Do you sometimes get into arguments with your parents? About what? Okay. What do you do when you get into arguments? Okay. Do you sometimes get into arguments with others your age? Sure. Why not? It's not a great, I feel like it's not a great question. Did you like the instructors? Again, a little bit binary. What did you like about the instructors? What didn't you like about the instructors? Much better, gives people more room to run and reflect. What activities did you like is fine, right? So anyway, you can see anything that kind of gets you into a space where people don't have a lot of room to run, right? Where it's very limiting, where it closes down the avenues of conversation. It lets people escape, right? Into yes or no kind of answers is a space you really, pardon me, want to avoid. Okay. So preparing your interview guide. It's fun. All right, let's talk about it. So preparing an interview guide, right? Or, sometimes we call this a interview schedule or schedule of questions. These are all terms that you might see. Questions. These are all terms you might see kind of thrown around interchangeably. Okay, so putting together your interview guide or your list of interview questions definitely is going to be one of the most important things that you do when you're prepping for an interview, because it's going to be, kind of your guide, the way that you figure out what is really important to you and the topics that you really, really want to talk about. And it's your sort of get out of jail free card, in a sense, when you hit the end of a topic, right? When you hit the end of a topic and someone maybe doesn't have anything else to say about it, you refer back to it and you pull out another question. Okay, so obviously, the first kind of question, right, and this relates to your research question. What is interesting about this issue? What's the thing that's puzzling you? Puzzling is kind of a funny word, but what do you want to know, right? Like in really simple, straightforward terms, based on the person that you are talking to. What do you want to know? And it depends. And I'll say, well, maybe I'll say that in a bit. We'll talk about preparing for interviews in a sec. Okay. Obviously, you always want to be open to new issues that arise, right? So you never want to be limited by the interview guide, right? That's why it's semi-structured or sometimes unstructured. You don't want to be limited by your interview guide. You want to be open to and willing to follow people down different kind of conversational paths. So you don't want to kind of limit things too much. Okay, so, and the other thing is, I guess, between interviews, right? When you've done one interview and you maybe learned something, always be open to adding new things to your interview guide or taking things out that didn't work, right? Most of the time, you don't have to stick to the same set of questions for every single person that you interview. So you really want to be open to things that worked or didn't work. Okay. Other things. Unstructured, right? We talked about this before. Generally, when we're talking unstructured interviews, we have a very short list of questions or issues we're talking about. I said kind of as a rough guide, 2 to 3. Semi-structured, right? Somewhere between maybe 15 and 20, depending on the length of the interview too. Obviously, you might have to scale this back. Let's say, I'm thinking that you're interviewing someone for about an hour and a half at 15 to 20. I think 1.5 hours. That's my kind of rough guess. However, let's say you're only an hour, you might want to pare that back to 10 to 15, right? Assuming that you're going to lose out some time to ask some of your questions. So it depends on the length. I think for an hour and a half to 2 hours, 15 to 20 questions, you might not get to them all. They might answer them out of sequence or answer without you ever having to ask them, but having them ready there is probably good. For an hour, 10 to 15 is probably lots. Okay. So, general research area, more specific research question, interview topic. Okay, I'm not going to follow this. I will talk a little bit about some things here. So when you're doing your interview guide, you can establish a kind of loose order of the questioning process. Really what's most important here is your kind of opening, right? your opening questions are going to be the ones that really set the tone for the interview. So you're definitely going to have like your question number one, right? Which is going to be the thing that you're hoping gets people talking. And then from there, right, you might have some kind of loose order, but that question number one, is pretty hard set. After that, I've always thought of it as like you have a kind of, think about it this way. Do it in your mind, right? Imagine the conversation with someone. Imagine how you think the conversation is going to play out and what kind of order you could go in. And then once you actually get into conversation with someone, be ready to immediately throw that out the window and like shuffle things around. Because no interview ever goes the way you think it's going to go. And people will start, especially if you've got great interview subjects, they're going to start talking. And they're going to give you all sorts of things that you never dreamed of. And they're going to answer half your questions without you even asking them. So, well, okay, maybe not half, but a lot, right? So you can have kind of a general loose order. I don't number my questions ever because I find that locks, for me, it locked me into wanting to do it in a particular order. So I just bullet pointed them with no numbers attached so that I could then be really loose and kind of flowy with my list of interview questions, right? You should have pretty broad questions, related to the research issue. It's still backing up all day, every day. Okay. Now this one, obviously, we kind of talked about that, you don't want jargon, right? Language that's understood by the participants. And again, you can absolutely ask experts things in expert language, right? If you're talking to someone, say, who works in the film industry, you can throw out film industry jargon, right? You can talk about the trades, you can talk about technical stuff that they're going to understand because they know the jargon, right? You should also know the jargon, but that's okay. So, but if you're talking to just like man off the street, right, regular, Joe, you really have to make sure that the language that you're using is understood, right? So you do have to think about this. And especially as academics, I was just saying with Paula, sometimes being in university and in academia can structure the way we think. And so we tend to be very jargony, right? And there's tons of examples of people asking these jargon-filled questions and people being like, what? I have no idea what you just said. Okay. No leading questions. So you really want to keep away from structuring your questions in a way that's kind of leading, right? So, you don't want to be like, so I think we all know that Mark Carney is an elitist. So what has your experience of Mark Carney been, right? You're kind of like, okay, you're kind of telling the person what you want to hear, right? I'm not saying Mark Carney is an elitist. I'm just thinking of that as an example, although I just finished rereading his book again, and I hate it even more the second time. But that's okay. That's just me. Yes?
So the difference between a leading question and like an interpreting question is like the bias, like showing the bias?
Yeah, and like pointing them towards an answer, right? Like, I'm trying to think of an example. Even like in the phrasing of the question, like, let's say you were talking to like an indigenous person. You're like, we all know that the effects of settler colonialism have been overwhelmingly negative for indigenous people. What is your experience of settler? Experience the negative effects of settler colonialism, right? You're immediately leading them into a kind of, you're not giving them a lot of space. You're structuring them to give you a particular thing, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So you can ask them, you could ask them about what's been your experience of kind of Canadian society as an indigenous person, and just let them tell you where the positives and negatives have been, if there's any positives or negatives, right? Without being like, we all know that your experience has been negative, right? Because racism, that might be true, but you don't want to be the one kind of putting the frame. And lots of people do this. We all know that Donald Trump is a monster, right? But you don't want to ask people in a way that is already framed that way. You want to ask them what they think of Donald Trump, not, you know, how would you phrase a really leading question? You know, how has Donald Trump's inherent racism affected you as a person of color, right? You're inherently kind of leading them into a particular answer. And you can be curious about that topic, you just have to get at it in a more neutral way, right? So that you're not forcing a person into a particular answer they might not want to give you.
So if you like go like, would you say that you feel this way about something? Like,
so I would say that that's a great, like if they've given you something, right? That's a probe, right? It's like, or even like a paraphrase, right? Where you're like, oh no, projector turning off. Okay, we're safe. Sorry, panic. It takes like 5 minutes to turn the damn thing back on. Yeah, when we get into like different kinds of questions, there's a lot of like paraphrase, and it's like, okay, so are you saying this, right? Or, you know, when you say this, do you mean that, right? And then those are kind of like probe or follow-up questions, or I sometimes call them paraphrase, where you like paraphrase what the person said to check that that's what they meant, right? So those are very good questions.
that's what I was going to ask. Like, does that relate to leading questions? But no.
No, because then hopefully you're reflecting something that they gave you, right? And then once they take you down a road, you can follow that road as far as you want, right? You just can't be the one that's like,
Introducing that.
right. It's like, okay, there's these many roads that you could go down, except that this one's closed, that one's closed, and you must absolutely go down this one, right? That's what you don't want in terms of a leading question, right? Forcing them down a path. And it can be really hard because sometimes ideologically you want to do that, but you really shouldn't, right? You should be much more neutral about it. So, and we all make mistakes. Okay, is that good? Okay. All right, you want prompts to ensure sufficient personal information about individual participants is collected to contextualize the data, right? And if you're not getting enough information about them in like an hour and a half interview, you have no business doing interviews, and you should retire, as an interviewer altogether. Okay. Okay, sorry. There's bubbles in my water, and it burned my throat a little. So, before an interview, familiarize yourself with the setting to contextualize the data, right? So you should know, if you're talking about people in a particular kind of research setting, you should know what that is, right? So that you can put what you're getting in context. I just want to, okay, sorry, I want to make sure, because I want to say this really clearly. Because this is a really simple point, but sometimes people forget to do it. Before you do an interview, you should do some research. And it's often, like, depending on what you're doing. But I'll give you sort of the context. Wow, you can't see my writing at all. It's because it's too bright in here. I'll choose orange for the rest of it. Okay. I'll tell you some of the context why I kind of think this is a good idea. One of the things that you want to maybe do is know something about the person that you're talking to before you actually go into the discussion, right? Especially, okay, I come out of the reason I talk about this is particularly like when I was doing kind of some of my interviews, I was talking to people who were relatively prominent and for whom you could find out a lot of things before you got into the discussion. So A, it saved me a lot of time, and B, it was really important for rapport, right? So I was talking to like film industry people, and so before I talked to any of them, I turned to my friends, IMDb and LinkedIn, to find out about them, right? So that I could be like, oh, I see you worked on this project. Tell me a little bit about that, right? And now, in some cases, this paid huge dividends, but I could put things in context in terms of their careers, in terms of who they were, in terms of what they've done, right? And I understood in some of the answers they were giving me what they were talking about, because I already knew kind of the context. And I will say sometimes this was just useful for building rapport. I did one particular interview where the person had worked on the show Gilmore Girls. And I opened with that, right? Like, okay, before I turned on the tape or the recording of the interview, I talked to them for like a solid 10 minutes about their time on Gilmore Girls, because my wife loved that show, and I knew they'd been on it, and I asked about their experience. What was it like? What was it like working with Amy Sherman Palladino and all this stuff? And then by the time we actually turned the recording on, this person was putty in my hands, right? Because they liked me, and I had said nice. Well, film industry people are sad. You just have to flatter them a little, and they melt. Like a little bit of flattery goes about 100,000 miles with them. But just by being really flattering about the work that she had done, she was just willing to answer just question after question. Was like super chipper and nice and kind to me, and it was just like it just opened her up, right? So doing a little bit of research in terms of like context, who the people you're talking to are, if it's a particular setting, knowing that setting is really, really important. Okay. This one I think is becoming less relevant. Maybe. Have good equipment and know how to use it. So it used to be, right, obviously, back in the day when you were doing interviews, you would have some kind of tape recorder, right, or a digital audio recorder. Increasingly, people just use their phones for a lot of things, but definitely know how to use it. And if you're ever doing interviewing, especially if you're doing one-on-one, like I'm going to take my little microphone off. You can buy these on Amazon, and you can buy one that has a set of two. So you can clip one on you and one on the person that you're talking to, and plug it into your laptop or your phone and record the interview with like amazing audio quality. And it used to be like, honestly, we used to have these like tape recorders that had like little kickstands and a microphone with like the fuzzy cover. And increasingly, that's far less relevant. But you should have good equipment and know how to use it, right? If you just show up and plop your phone down on the table and try to record, you might get poor audio quality, and that can give you some problems, right? Especially when it comes to that most dreaded of processes, transcribing. I kind of wish every time I said transcribing, it got dark and lightning bolts and thunder started. I should have a sound effect because I hate transcribing with a fiery passion. If you have terrible audio quality, transcribing becomes an absolute nightmare. The other thing that becomes a nightmare is if someone is sitting around with you waiting for an interview to start and you're messing around with your equipment, right? Because something's not working and the recording's not going, and you get flustered. They're going to start to feel nervous and like, hey, should we do this another time? So before you ever show up, make sure all your stuff works. Okay, here. These are all tips and tricks. Use a quiet and private setting for interviews, but not too private. So I don't know if this is relevant. Never go to someone's house. Ever. Like, it's just a terrible idea. We've had researchers do this as part of the prison project, go interview people at their homes. It's a bad idea. Nothing bad happened. But you want a private setting for interviews, but not too private. So if you're meeting someone, you want to make sure that you're in... there can be all sorts of weird things that happen, right, when it comes to interviewing. So if you're thinking about safety, your safety and the safety of the participant, you would want somewhere that's quiet enough that you are not going to have problems with, sometimes people like to meet at cafes. This can be fine, but sometimes it's so noisy that it can screw up your recording and make it difficult to hear stuff later. But it's if you're kind of off in the corner of a cafe, that's probably private enough. You can have a one-on-one discussion and probably no one's listening. My kind of happy place for this is like a closed room with windows. especially if you know that people are going to be walking around outside. So I think of like the public library, where you can often rent, or like book rooms, or even the libraries here, where you can book kind of private rooms, but they all have these glass windows so people can then see in. These are great spaces for interviews because you can shut the door, but you're still kind of semi in public, right? So that if something happens, right, you never know what's going to happen in an interview. Let's say someone freaks out at you, or someone suddenly gets the wrong idea and they start getting like handsy or romantic with you, and you're not wanting that, right? There's people around, or someone accuses you of having done that to them. Well, you can be like, well, we were in a public place and no one else saw anything, right? So for your safety and other people's safety, you want quiet and private, but not too private, right? Definitely not a room with no windows. Definitely not, your apartment or your house or their house. Somewhere where there's people around, and just like semi-public keeps things calm, right? People don't act out as much when they know they might be observed. So, all right. So, use good interview techniques, active listening, right? So you want to give people some feedback while they're talking, right? You can take some notes. I always had like note paper to take some notes, but you don't want to like, for example, like be tuning them out or writing so many notes that you're not paying attention to what they're saying, and you want to give them some feedback as they're talking, right? So this can be as simple as like, hopefully you all know what active listening is. Give them something, right? Oh, okay, that's interesting. Little participles to show them that you're listening to them. Wow. I know it's dumb. But sometimes just giving them a, whoa, that's crazy, right? If it is in fact crazy. If it's not crazy, don't say, whoa, that's crazy. Gives them feedback. And sometimes it, will spur them into something else. My favorite one is like, are you serious? And then they're like, yeah, totally. And let me tell you another story. And it's like, you've fallen into my trap again with the more stories. Anyway, I love the are you serious is one of my favorite active listening phrases, because it's like, if you time it right, it almost always people go to the next story, right? And they give you more, right? Or they give you more depth about how crazy that experience was. So active listening, really important. And those little like feedback phrases that tell people that you're engaged in listening. And, do things like eye contact, right? Make eye contact. I know sometimes that's uncomfortable and hard, but it gets people talking. Trust me. And they feel like you're engaging with them. Okay. Be knowledgeable about the topic of study. I think I told you this already when I was talking about how people will test you. I did this one interview. It was with a vice president at Sony. And, they had been sort of told by their boss that they needed to talk to me because he didn't want to talk to me. So he passed it down the chain. There were political reasons. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So he didn't want to talk to me, but he's like, okay, well, let's throw this kid a bone because we had a mutual friend. Anyway, it's not important. So he had her talk to me, and she was slightly annoyed by this. And so she tested me like, do you know this? Do you know this? Do you know this? And once I proved that I knew as much about Russian TV as someone who works in Russian TV, then it was like, okay, we were off to the races. We were best friends. We were vibing. To use a Gen Z phrase, pick up some phrases from my kids. But it's true. Like, once she got past this, like, this is some dumb academic who's just like asking questions about shit they don't know about, to this is actually a person who's genuinely engaged and has seen my work and is like interested and really has knowledge. Then it was like, oh, well, now we were like, honestly, it was like, well, did you see this show? I'm like, yeah. And like, what did you think about it? And I was like, well, here's like, I thought it was good for this reason. And like, I totally agree. Anyway, it was a fun interview. But it was like if I hadn't been knowledgeable about it, if I hadn't been informed before I stepped in there, this would have been the shortest interview ever. It would have been like 15 minutes. It's like, okay, you're wasting my time. You don't know anything, and your questions are dumb. And that interview ended up going long. So be knowledgeable about the topic of study. Don't come in knowing nothing, or people will get annoyed with you, right? Okay, yes?
If you're interviewing someone that is like, I guess you could say quote unquote expert, like you're asking about like the experience of say police officer in their field, are you allowed to introduce some sort of jargon in there? Like
Definitely.
okay.
Yeah, especially now, it may actually be helpful.
Yeah, I thought, 'cause it's kind of hard to like not use jargon if you're interviewing someone about their actual like work experience.
Yeah, and sometimes like using jargon in that scenario ingratiates you to them. They're like, oh, this person gets it, right? And because it's their everyday language, right? I don't know police jargon as well, but I know TV jargon. But yeah, like you definitely can, right? As long as, I mean, you'll probably have to, when you're writing up your research, explain what the jargon means. But if you know, now there, you have to know the jargon too, right? One of the things that could happen is if you talk to people in their jargon, they like you. If you misuse their jargon, they think you're dumb, right? So you have to really know the jargon before you go in, or yeah, they're going to be like, you're a moron, right? You're just some pretender, right? So you have to kind of, especially with cops, I think like cops get super annoyed when the jargon is off TV shows. Yeah. Or lawyers. Yeah, lawyers would get annoyed with that, right? They would get super annoyed if you're like interviewing them and you're using like TV jargon. Doctors too, actually. Doctors really hate medical shows because they're like, that's stupid. Like you just saw that on House and it's dumb, right? Or whatever. Grey's Anatomy is not real medicine. I had my sister-in-law tell me that one time, and I'm like, because I was like, oh, is it like Grey's Anatomy? And she's like, Grey's Anatomy is not real medicine. She's a nurse, and she got very annoyed with me. But yeah, you have to get the jargon right, or they will treat you like a moron, which isn't always the best way to conduct an interview. But it happens. It happens. But yeah, definitely like these professions, especially ones that appear on TV a lot, be careful with jargon you think you know, and especially like never tell a Canadian police officer about Miranda rights because they'll mock you because it's American, right?
Yeah,
we don't have Miranda rights. We have something different that does the same thing, but it's not Miranda rights. Okay, anyway, sorry, does that answer your question? Yeah. This is a be gentle, sensitive, open, so the interviewee can freely express their opinion and not interrupting. Yeah, don't interrupt people. I don't know about sensitive, open. I mean, it sounds like therapy, which we all love, but definitely listen to people, right? And let people express their opinions. Don't jump in. Yeah, like if they ask you questions, you can answer them, but don't be like constantly interrupting them or they're going to get really, really annoyed with you. And yeah, okay, this one's the hard one. This is where the art comes in. Be flexible and steering, flexible enough to respond to new themes raised by the participant, but steering to redirect the discussion, right? So you want to obviously, I don't know, it's like improv. Have any of you ever done improv? Right? It's like, no, you should. It's fun.
Yes, and.
What's that?
Yes, and.
Yes, and, right? Like you always want to take what people give you, right? And that's like one of the rules of improv. Always take what people give you, but you can redirect it, right? Like, one of the real skills of good improv people is that they're able to redirect, something that someone gave them, saying yes, but like turning it into what they want it to turn into. And that's kind of the same thing you find with interviewing, right? Take what people give you, but redirect in really fun and interesting ways, or just ways that get you back on topic. And obviously, if someone like steers off into a rant or a topic that has nothing to do with what you wanted to talk about, you want to thank them for that in a kind way, and then kind of like pull it back to what you wanted to talk about, right? And depending on who you talk to, I know like one of my colleagues has interviewed like anti-global warming activists, right? They're going to go off on kind of bizarre rants, and you kind of have to steer that conversation back to what you want to talk about. Okay, so if you want to talk about anti-globalization stuff and they steer you off into vaccines are bad, you can be like, okay, yeah, that's interesting, and then steer them back to, their anti-global warming rants. Okay, kinds of questions. So, kinds of questions. These are important because you'll have to provide a few for your mini lab and then your major lab, and maybe an exam question. So learn them, love them, and all that jazz. So introducing questions, right? You can have more than one introducing question in an interview, right? Because sometimes you shift topics and you move into a new introducing question. Generally speaking, your first question is going to be an introducing question. Tell me, please tell me when you first became interested in furries, right? So I have to bring it back to furries at least once a class. When you first became interested in furries, right? To get them talking, right? So that they tell you, I was 8 years old and my father threw out my stuffed bear, Mr. Snuffleupagus, and I've never gotten over the trauma, so I decided to be a stuffed animal myself. I don't know. I've made up a tragic backstory for my furry. Okay, so I had no friends, and I mostly identified with my cat, so I decided I wanted to be a cat. Right, whatever it happens to be, how did you end up working in Russian TV? Right, I asked this of all the British and Americans that I knew that had worked in Russian TV. I was like, how did you end up working in Russian TV? Right, and then they would tell me, these crazy stories of how they were out of work in England or the US, and someone approached them and they ended up, going over and the money was great and all of that stuff. Or they had a girlfriend who was Russian and they moved to Moscow and then they were looking for work and blah, blah, blah. All sorts of fun things. So follow-up questions, right? So this is kind of what Paula and I were talking about. Rephrase the interviewee's question and ask them to elaborate on the answer. When you said, you were motivated, what did you mean by that, right? So you clear things up, right? But you can rephrase, right? When you say, I don't know, and you can imagine, right? When you say, you were interested in animals, or you feel a strong connection to nature, what do you mean by that? So that's your follow-up question. Basically, if they say something, like anything, you could be like, okay, when you say X, can you tell me more about that? Or what do you mean by that? Explain that further, right? All right, probing questions. These are often short. General questions inviting the respondent to reflect more deeply on what they said. What do you mean by that, right? Or can you give me an example, right? Sometimes you might throw that in with that same kind of phrasing as your follow-up question. It's like when you said, X, right? When you said you really are connected to nature, what did you mean by that? Or can you give me an example of a time you felt really connected to nature, right? Or something like that. I'm circling around the furry thing again. Okay. And then specifying questions, right? Factual. What did you do then? What happened then? Yeah. Oh, sorry. So usually with the follow-up question, right, you're wanting to get a little bit more clarity. With the probing question, okay, so here, I'll put it here. Clarity. You want them to clear something up. And here you want depth. Right? So you want them to give you a deeper understanding of what they're talking about. So what did you mean by that? Give me an example. How so? How so is okay. Sorry, does that explain? Does that answer? Okay. Yeah. So here, clarity. Here, depth. Okay. Specifying questions. What happened then? Oh, what did you do? What happened then? Where did you go? What did it taste like? More detail, right? But factual, right? Stuff that's really tangible, not opinions based. That. Okay, so in direct and indirect questions, these ones are a little tricky. So Yeah, I got time. So, direct questions, right? Direct questions are easy in the sense that you're just asking straightforward questions about people's perceptions, right? Do you find it easy to keep smiling when serving customers? Do you like how you are treated by management here, right? You know, what do you think, right? What do you think about X? You know, what do you think about this aspect of the subculture you're in? You know, whatever you want, but just straightforward, what is their perception of it? Sometimes, and again, this is kind of a general rule, can be best left until the kind of middle to late part of an interview to not kind of skew things too much in the direction of their opinion, right? So, but there's not really like a hard and fast rule. I would say middle to end of an interview. Now, the indirect question. So I actually don't think how do you feel about is a great indirect question, but let's focus on this one. So if you remember, right, when we were talking about survey questions, right, I talked about the neighbor question. Do you remember that? The neighbor question, where you don't ask someone directly about their opinion. You ask about what what they think their neighbors think, to kind of get them out of the frame of mind, right, of themselves, or maybe, away from social desirability bias. That's the big one, right? Some things they might not want to tell you. Indirect questions are kind of similar, right, in that you want to ask them not about their own perceptions, but what other people think. And again, this can be revelatory of their opinions in some ways, framed through, I always think of it this way, framed through what other people think, right? So this is a good question here. Like, what do most people around here, okay, it's a little clunky, think about the way management treats its staff, right? If you wanted to put it in slightly less clunky terms, right, you could easily ask, what do your coworkers think? Or what do the employees here, or how do they like the way, that's bad phrasing too. But what do most people think around here think of the way management treats its staff? What do your coworkers think about the way management treats them, right? But you see, it's kind of indirect, right? You're asking about their coworkers' perception. They're going to probably include their own opinion in there, but it's like you're asking about general opinions around, right? So it's a little bit more indirect. You're not asking necessarily about their perception. You're asking about people around them. What do most people around here think of the way management treats its staff? What do your coworkers think about the corporate policy, that says the customer is always right? Those sorts of things, right? Does that kind of make sense? You're asking indirectly, right? You're asking about other people's perceptions. How does your family feel about you being a furry, right? You're asking about other people's perceptions, or technically their perception of other people's perceptions. What do most furries think about, people who join the fandom, right, or join the community, right? How do they integrate newcomers? You're asking about other people, but their opinions are going to be included, and they might be more willing to tell you things. Again, the truck went away. There's silence for the first time. They might be more willing to sort of tell you things that they think if they can phrase it as, all of us think this, right? So again, social desirability bias. If you think you're running into social desirability bias with a particular question, you might want to phrase it in an indirect way so that they have space to dissociate from it a little bit. Okay, oops. I remember, I need to fix this slideshow because I have the same slides twice. And these ones are better. I keep forgetting about this because they have fun illustrations. Okay. Structuring questions. now I would like to move on to a different topic. So I mean here, it's like, okay, like it doesn't have to be now. That's a really, again, like mechanical way of doing it in an interview, and I wouldn't recommend, now I would like to move on to a different topic. It's like, okay, I have something else I wanted to ask you about, and then jump into your topic, right? Or I have another question I wanted to ask you, like now I want to move on to a different topic. To me, feels like a robot, but you can phrase this in all sorts of ways, and then you jump into your kind of questions, like, what else did you want to talk to them about, right? Okay, maybe I'll go interpreting questions, and I'll talk about silence. Interpreting questions, do you mean your leadership role had to change from one of encouraging others to, okay, so then you're kind of, this is like the paraphrase, right? The interpreting question, you're paraphrasing. And you're checking for meaning, right? Because maybe what they said wasn't particularly clear, and you're not quite sure what they meant. So with an interpreting question, you will paraphrase it, and you're like, did you mean paraphrase of what they said, right? Because often people will ramble, right? They'll give you these long discourses on something, and there's kind of a theme in there. And what you want to do is condense that theme down and paraphrase, right? And then check that you got it right. And the interpreting question is for you to check that you've understood what they're saying correctly, so they can give you some feedback on that. Or if you got it wrong, they can correct something, right? And especially like even, like with what Paula was talking about with like experts, sometimes there's going to be a little bit more nuance than what you picked up on. So the interpreting question can be a really good way, and it's really hard to prep these in advance. I'll say, right? This is not a question that you can really like prepare as part of your interview script, because you have to sort of reflect what they said back to them. But it can be a really good way of like getting more depth of information or checking your understanding, especially on topics where people are experts, right? So, paraphrase, do you mean that? Paraphrase, and then they're going to be like, well, what almost, but what I actually meant was da 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 da. Or maybe they're like, yes, in which case you move on. Okay, no, should I talk about silence? I have a bad relationship with silence in that if I have one flaw as an interviewer, and I have many, I suck at silence. And if you've ever taken a class with me where it's a little bit more interactive, and I do more kind of Q&A with people, you will realize in retrospect, or if you're currently taking it, that I'm absolutely terrible at silence, because I will fill the silence with blabber until someone kind of shuts me up. Except now, where I will be perfect. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure Paula can tell you about critical media studies where...
I'm shocked that I managed to get through a 3-hour class every week. That's the first one that I actually went to in my entire degree.
You know what the worst thing is? Is next year they put it at 9 a.m.
That is criminal.
I also agree. I don't want to teach it at 9 a.m., but I will. Okay, but silence, right? I will blabber on, and I'll be like, so yeah, I mean, you could, what do you think? I'm bad at silence. Pausing to let people think a little bit, so that they can then answer is not a bad thing. Don't pause for so long that it gets awkward. And I'm like, because I'm a blabbermouth, which is why I'm, a good professor, because I can stand up, or a professor, maybe not a good one. I'll let you decide. That's why I like this job, I guess, because I like to talk, but I'm really bad at shutting up and letting people answer. I tend to not do silence. I fill the silence with like small prompts, further explanations, so people can still think while I'm kind of prompting some more until it becomes uncomfortable. Okay, so don't let it get uncomfortable, right? If someone obviously is kind of struggling or not sure how to answer, this can be as bad as doing nothing, because it's like, it can be as bad as talking too much, because then they're like, feeling uncomfortable. So it's kind of an art figuring out how much silence you should have. I tend to like zero silence, but that's just me. Okay. Maybe it's because oh yeah, please.
Pose the question, and then as they try and respond to that, or even after they might respond, if you're thinking that maybe below them what they did before, that's a situation where you might pause.
Yeah, or just to give them a second to think, right? I guess the idea with silence is don't, if they're not answering right away, give them a moment to reflect and see if they have something to say about it. If they don't, you can kind of like jump in with like another prompt, right? Like for me, it's always like, think of it this way. That's my, like if the silence gets too long, I'm like, okay, so think of it this way, and then try to like reframe the question in the same thing you were trying to get to where there was a silence in another way. Like I said, I do this a lot in class, and it's a very similar sort of, and not in this class as much, but in some other classes I teach, it's a very similar sort of technique of basically just, sorry, I just had an intrusive thought.
It's like going at it from a different angle to sort of
Yeah.
to get to their understanding of it.
But the idea with the silence is to just let people think, because if you come at them too much, like, I guess like this staccato kind of attack, they might not have a second to kind of reflect on what you're actually asking for. But obviously, if it's like too long and they're like don't really know, then definitely jump in with like another little prompt or a clarification, or let me ask it another way, that kind of thing. So it's like I said, it's more art than it is science of trying to figure out where and how long the silence should be. When it gets too uncomfortable, obviously you want to kind of pare it back. Okay. So, yeah, listen, I know it's a conversation, but interviewing is a conversation where you are meant to take the much more passive role, in the sense of, you don't want to be interjecting too much of your own experience into the interview, right? It's not an equal conversation. Your part of the conversation is to get them talking, not to like, I said I've vibed with people. It's not to vibe too much with people, right? You want mostly to hear what they have to say, because theoretically the reason that you're interviewing them is they know something about a question that you want to know about. Okay. Avoid bringing anxiety to the interviewee, right? Don't harm your participants. If they're really uncomfortable with something, it's okay to stop or to ask them, it seems like you're a little uncomfortable. Do you want to change the topic, right? Or is this okay, right? You can check in with your participants and be like, it seems like this is a lot. Are you okay to continue, right? All fine. You really, again, don't want to harm your participants. And depending what you're talking about, most of my stuff is pretty, like not going to traumatize people. But obviously some people do get into some really serious topics in interviews. And so, you want to be careful with your participants. Okay. And then vignette questions. So vignette questions, right, kind of like we use them in surveys, are little scenarios you could give to people, right? They can be used to ground your interviewee's ideas and accounts and behavior in a particular situation. Like, okay, if you want to find out abstractly, like, what would you do in this situation, right? So let's say, what you can invent any situation you want for a vignette question, right? But it should be obviously related to your topic, right? So, if you were presented with this scenario, what would you do? That's a vignette question, right? So you give them like a little story, like, you're walking down the street and you're talking to a police officer. You're walking down the street and you're off duty and you see someone being robbed. What would you do, right? That's a little vignette question to get them thinking about how they would act in that circumstance. And then, like, it has the advantage of kind of abstracting their behavior, right? It's not then suddenly like, oh, this is an actual thing that happened to me, but you can ask how they would behave in a certain scenario. So vignette questions can be handy as well. And fun. Sometimes they're fun to come up with. Okay. 308. How many interview slides do I have left, by the way? I've not been keeping track. Okay, kind of a lot. We'll continue this next time. Okay, interviewing's fun. I told you, I love interviewing. I have lots to say about it. All right, so field notes. Right, this is the field notes portion of the interview. So after you do an interview, right, you should have an accompanying document talking about how the interview went, right? And this can be kind of general comments, anything that sticks out to you, right? You should put in your field notes, right? Whatever it happened to be that stuck out to you, put it in there. So it went well, it didn't go well, whatever it happens to be. Where the interview was conducted, obviously, right? Where the interview was conducted. You can talk about that. Other feelings and issues raised during the interview. So anything that sticks out to you, right? Anything, how the person seemed, how different questions affected them, how they, anything that's notable about the interview, you should note down. And what was going on around the interview, right? Let's say that you were renting a room at the public library and a horde of children went by singing loudly, and it sort of disrupted the interview, right? Anything that was going on around it. Or you could put like social or world events. Or like world events, right? Maybe you were doing an interview, I don't know, the week that there was the Four Nations Cup, right? And so your interviewee kept talking about, the Four Nations Cup, or there was like they were talking about how patriotic they feel or whatever. You might want to put some notes in, just giving yourself some context, right? Context. It was after Donald Trump said he was going to tariff Canada, and there was this hockey tournament going on. So again, why would you do that kind of stuff? So that if you go back to this later, maybe 2 years later, let's say you go back 2 years later, right? You can look at your field notes and be like, oh yeah, I remember, right? It was that week that there was the hockey thing, right? That was happening, and the tariffs and all of that stuff, so that you don't lose that context. Now, you need to do this, again, as soon as possible, so that you keep as much of the context in your head. And hours later, days later, you're already going to start forgetting things about that particular context. So you want to have these as dense and close to the time you conducted the interview as possible. Like all field notes, do it as soon as you can. Okay. Interview topics. You can talk about all these things. Values, beliefs, behaviors, their formal and informal roles, their relationships, different places, emotions, encounters, and stories. You definitely want stories. Stories are the best. Trust me when I say, when you are working to write up a piece of research, stories play the best. They are so much fun to write with. And when people tell you stories, they are absolutely the most fun to write with. So if they tell you stories, you're in a good place. Transcription. I hate transcription. Okay. Obviously, sorry, this is out of the textbook. And I initially created these slides off of notes from the publisher. And I have some of these I haven't changed. Use an electronic recorder, obviously, right? And most people now use their phone, right, or laptop. And again, there's some really great equipment out there, these little lavalier mics. They're super cheap, like $60. They work great, and they can get you some amazing audio quality. The interviewee should have consented to the recording. Yes, always tell people you're recording them. Don't record them without their consent. Most people put this in their information and consent letter, right, that you're going to be recording the interview, so that when they sign, they know that. But then, I think always make sure when you are starting your recording, tell the person that you are starting the recording, right? And especially like sometimes, like when I've done interviews, I have a little off the record portion, right? And usually before the interview, before I turn it on, where I'm kind of chit-chatting, right? Where I'm trying to establish rapport, I'm thanking the person for their time, and it's sort of understood that what they're saying isn't yet sort of being recorded and is therefore not official, right? So, I mean, if you ever listen to my interview transcripts, which you never, or my interviews, which you never will because I'll never let you, you would hear that I'm like, okay, I'm starting the recording now, right? And that's the first thing that gets recorded. And they're like, okay, right? So they know that now everything is being recorded. It's all official and on the record and all of that stuff. So always tell people that you've started the recording so that they know from that point, everything they say is, theoretically on the record. Okay. Now, transcription. Transcription really sucks. Transcribe only the parts you need, right? Because it takes a really long time. It's expensive and slow, right? So if you're bad at it, now I know some people that are really good at it and they can do it really, really fast. When I was doing it, honestly, an hour was taking me 4 to 5 hours to do, and it sucked. Which is why I outsourced it to a company. Even though that clearly violated my ethics, I didn't care. No one ever found out. But I did, because I just couldn't. Like, I had so many interviews, and it was going to take me months to get through it, transcribing it. Because I only had like basic training. I didn't have the cool foot pedals, and the foot pedals are like $150. I didn't want to buy one. So here's what I'll suggest. When you're doing your ethics and when you're doing your information and consent letter, put in there, and this is increasingly the way people are doing, that you're going to do your initial transcription with AI, right? Things like Otter AI, which you can find, and it's relatively cheap, and that you're then going to go through it and like fix it. And I would put that honestly in your ethics and in your information and consent letter, that you're going to be using these outside programs to do the transcription, and that you're going to do that to help you. Why? Because you don't want to do this. It's a horrible task, and no human being enjoys transcription, except those people who do. Those people are monsters. It's a really awful task. Like, honestly, think about listening to the same interview over and over again in 20-second increments. Because this is how it works, right? You listen to 20 seconds, and then you pause, and then you type out what you think was there, and then you go back, and you check, and then you fix it, and then you play another, like, maybe not even 20 seconds, maybe 10, and then you type, and then you go back, and you check it. And imagine doing that for an interview that's 2.5 hours long. Does that sound fun? No, you'll feel like you're going insane, and you've heard the same things over and over again. And then, like, imagine there's one section where the audio gets a little muffled, and you have to listen to that section 20 times to try and get at what the person was saying, and then you still end up writing inaudible. Yeah, it's awful. So I fully endorse using AI. AI is like the way to go now, and it's incredibly cheap. I think like Otter AI, I think it's like $16 a month or something, and there's other ones that are around the same, around $20 a month, and you're probably not going to use transcription for like 5 years, so you can like subscribe short term and pay. So do that. But yeah, training is required, definitely. Be careful. Possible errors, mishearings, fatigue, carelessness. And again, AI and using outside transcription services are going to solve a lot of that. Why? Well, because you can get, say, AI to do the first pass, and then you go back, listen to it, and fix problems, right? And it's trust me, don't do it yourself. It's really slow. Okay, that's close enough. We'll start here next time. I'll put a little bit of star here. So we got 2 minutes left, and I don't want to talk for 2 more minutes, so let's leave it there. All right. Have a good one. We'll see you on Wednesday, where we'll finish talking about interviews, probably. Wow, there's a lot of slides left. Oh, because we have to talk focus groups too. I love focus groups. All right.